So, for the very first painting video of the year, I wanted to do something that's within my comfort zone, something that isn't too strenuous and doesn't take a lot of my brain power. I just wanted to paint something self-indulgent but also a little conceptual. I will be breaking down my thought process while I'm painting, and hopefully you can get insight and inspiration. So yeah, let's actually start painting stuff. I will be painting a centaur today, a majestic centaur. I start with the lines of action. I push myself to keep the drawing parts loose and the lines carefree, just because I want the gestures to be organic and fluid. I never focus on the details during this stage. I just want to get the feel for what the overall gesture and pose is. And for this piece, I wanted him to look mighty and proud, so both his human and horse half should exude confidence. I like the first pass of the sketch, but I feel like I've done this exact same pose before, mainly the human half, so you will see me altering this part a couple times in this video. I am quite satisfied with how the horse half looks though, especially his legs and how flimsy and curved the lines are when they're supposed to be strong and muscular. I like that contrast. I was flying by at this point in the sketch. I felt like the idea was coming together pretty fast because the marks I drew were solid, so I proceeded with refining the sketch. But the longer I looked at the overall composition, the more I felt like it was boring. The elements are working together to create a decently designed character, and I could pass this off as a successful sketch, but this was not fulfilling me conceptually. I already spent a long time on the rough pose sketch, and I really liked how the horse half looks, so I decided to halt the illustration, work on something else, and then come back with fresher eyes. I have decided that I want to revise the human half, and I think the shape language has improved significantly. But there's still room to make the illustration more interesting. So I decided I want the centaur to be a warrior. I want him to be wielding weapons, and that shifted the concept entirely. The artwork went from a basic illustration to an actual character design. Adding weapons gave the character purpose and narrative. You can create a story just based on this design choice alone. Who is he? What are his motives? Is he a protector or is he a threat? His weapons of choice are twin blades, and I decided I wanted the swords to be curved, one to subvert expectation, and two to keep the shape language of the piece cohesive. I decided to add another element that defines this character. I want to add several decapitated heads across his body. It's a little too morbid and grotesque, but I thought this was a great concept because when we think of unicorns, we think they are friendly and benevolent. So much of media about unicorns portray them as divine and pure. These are creatures you'd want as allies, so I decided, how about I flip the archetype for this one? This is clearly not a friend, and this is not a protector. I already like the face design on this than the previous one. I think a front-facing profile is important when presenting a character. I should be able to see his expression, and I want him to look sinister, and I want him to be bold and looking head-on. More appropriate design choice is to give him angry eyes and a devious grin. This is the Huntsman. You can derive from his design that he is a violent creature and he will not hesitate inflicting harm or killing. You can argue that he is just a guardian of some sort, a sentinel of the forest perhaps, and he's only killing those who trespass sacred grounds. But that assumption is quickly refuted, mainly because of the fact that he is collecting body parts as trophies. I made him wear a necklace made of severed ears, a tongue, and a jawbone, as if it's a medallion of his victories and battles. It is also a conscious decision to not draw the decapitated heads as decaying body parts. This suggests that these people have not been dead for long, and perhaps they have been recently hunted. This character has been doing this for so long that he will keep his pile of trophies fresh frequently. This emphasizes the sadistic and barbaric nature of the character. I initially wanted to paint blood across the lower region of his face and his chest area, but I feel like that would have been too much as far as the violence, but also with the characterization. I'd like to assume that even though this character is brutal, he still keeps a pristine and sophisticated method to his killing. I think that's about it for his characterization. I honestly envisioned more decoration of dismembered body parts across his horse half, but I feel like that would oversell the idea and crowd the visual space in the middle. I'd like to keep the design about 80% elegant and 20% gruesome. Maybe he's not parading his stats as a cannibalistic savage. Maybe this is just his catch of the day. Normally, I do the rough shading and lighting after the finalized sketch, then I choose color overlays or gradient maps, and then I start the rendering phase. Since his palette is decided by default, I proceeded with rendering the forms in grayscale. I seldom do this because when you work with grayscale, you're not really accessing the possibilities of color blending and how values work when your sketch has color. It often looks muddy. I'm sure there's a principle to that I just don't have the words for, and there are other videos out there that are comprehensive with explaining grayscale and color theory. I did do this coloring method later on for the flesh colored elements, mainly the spoils all over his body. The rendering phase took quite a while, but I think it's a more effective method when you want to make sure that you're sculpting the forms properly. The values need to be correct and readable, so this was the appropriate rendering choice. For the most part, the entire character has low contrast and is pretty bright, but I made sure to paint very dark shadows on his upper torso area, specifically his face. It's basic principle in lighting and values. Your eyes are pretty much drawn to where the contrast is. There are certain motifs in this illustration that keep the overall picture cohesive. There's an abundance in curved lines and strokes, mainly his hair, his limbs, his tail, and his twin swords. All these elements depict elegance and grace, for the most part, but there are also sharp shapes in the character. His horn stands out not only because it's in the middle of his forehead, but it's also the only straight lines I drew. Perhaps this is to hammer in the idea that the Huntsman is a dangerous and cunning character. This motif can also be seen in his sharp twin blades. I am going on a small tangent here about this illustration, specifically the composition. I know that his horse half doesn't make sense anatomically. Horses or ungulates in general have torsos that are curving downward. A lot of anatomy illustrations depict them as having almost pot bellies, and so their spines should be bent downward. His horse half should form an elongated S shape. Instead, I rendered his torso similarly to a canine animal, where his spine is mostly horizontal, almost arching, but that's a stylistic choice. I want his backside to form a continuous curved line from the tip of his hair to the tip of his tail. I will be showing a map of the shape language of this illustration later in the video. Whether they're subconsciously decided or not, I think it's fun to break down a character into simplified shapes to see how their designs are working or not working. I've already decided from the start that I wanted this character to be pale white in color. If you're familiar with my work, you know that I have an affinity for painting monochromatic characters, and I stick to a very limited color palette. He needs to look inhumane, and by nature, I think humans see paleness as dangerous, since it's associated with being ill, and death, and rot. Clearly, this is a character we should stay away from. I've been taking digital art seriously for about 6 years now, and I've only recently learned of using gradient maps as a coloring tool. It is so convenient to assign colors to specific tones of gray. That's why if you have solid values, you can just paint by numbers, technically. I want this character to be mostly pale, but with cooler undertones, perhaps purple even. I made his eyes red, which made him look more feral and vicious. There's already enough captivating elements to the character. It's important to keep him dangerous and unrelatable, and I think bloodshot eyes employ that idea perfectly. I also didn't paint pupils on his eyes. Maybe it's magic, maybe it's cataracts. I think it's a good touch that I kept that window and vessel closed so you can't look into it. This basically removes his familiarity and relatability because, as you know, the eyes are the windows to the soul. And maybe he doesn't have a soul. For his accessories, I put an overlay of flesh colors, but I decided I wanted the overall color scheme to be muted, so they're barely different in color, but I hope the implication that they are separate elements is still there. Subtle splashes of yellow and warm tones are also there to provide contrast against the purple-gray undertones, and I think the overall color scheme works. It's a little too on the nose, but I may have subconsciously built a color palette that's commonly used for designing villains. Striking reds, muted purples, and a touch of regal yellows. Here is the shape language I was talking about earlier. It is subtle, and I don't even know if everything is intentional, but most of it is. I like keeping my characters interesting this way just because I barely enjoy painting backgrounds. A simple design character like the Huntsman needs to be presented in a dynamic pose at the very least. And that's about it for the Huntsman. I'm very proud of how this illustration turned out, and I'm very curious if I could make him an original character of mine. I think there's enough interesting things about him that warrant a lore, or even appearances in future art. Who knows? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again next time.